And thank you for having me back in Copenhagen. It's probably 4 or 5 months since I've been here. It was a pretty intensive few months in the competitive dialogue that Anders was mentioning before that. So I'm very familiar over the last few years with Copenhagen. It's always a pleasure to be back. So really I wanted to talk specifically to the question of design. And I will use the case study from the case that Anders was talking around in the big data challenge within Copenhagen to try and position what I think is an appropriate approach to technology design, where technology is the servant and not the master of the process. And I think it's important because I've been swimming around in the sea of smart cities for the past, almost 6 or 7 years now. And I think if I characterize where we're at on the smart or intelligent cities debate, I would say we spend an awful lot of money as industries and as a city, or a series of cities and an industry, and have really very little to show for it at this stage. And I think the reason behind that is it was a technology-driven discourse for the main part of this process. We started with a series of really interesting technologies, and then we started looking for applications for those technologies. And by doing that, we completely missed the story. And where we got to is a point where no one really understands, as Peter spoke about, what a smart city is. So when you go to mayors and you go to city administrators and you talk about smart cities, they're like, well, what is it? And if you define what it is by the technologies that you're implementing, it gets completely lost. And I think the only way to solve for this problem is to start from the other end of the equation, which is to start with the problems that exist within the city, identify where the solutions may be using an anthropological and human-centered design approach, and then look for the data and the technologies that you can apply within that context. And that's the approach that we've taken. So in this short little case, what I just want to do is talk a little bit about how we have approached it in that way, rather than looked at the data and looked at the technology and tried to find an application. So this is the broad outline of what we're trying to achieve in this space. Now, many of you probably have heard about open data and the idea of bringing public sector data sets to the table and allowing third parties to innovate on those data sets to provide new products and services. We think that's going to be the future and is a small part of the present. But what we're really interested in is, within the context of the city overall, the really interesting data sets that relate to the city aren't necessarily owned by the city and the public sector. They sit in banks, they sit in telcos, they sit in pharma companies. And yet they're proprietary data sets and they never see the light of day, right? So just to take an example, telephone companies hold information on how many people are logged on to any cell phone mast at any point in time within the city. That gives you a pretty good proxy for population density in real time. Now the trouble is, that data never really sees the light of day. So I could think of tons of really interesting applications that I could develop with a view on where everyone is in the city and a population density map. But if I don't have access to those data sets, what can I do with them? Nothing. So what we have really tried to position over the last 3 or 4 years is a proposition that the city should be a protagonist and a driver of bringing all data, both their own data but also private sector data, to the table and providing a marketplace to access that data. And it's okay if those are proprietary data sets and they need to be paid for. If there's value in those data sets, then the innovators will be willing to pay for access to the data. But at the moment, the marketplace doesn't exist. to access that data. If I want to get that data, I have to go directly to the telephone company and negotiate a bilateral transaction between me and them. And the transaction costs get too high, so the data never sees the light of day. So what we're saying is, well, it was very clear in the 18th and 19th centuries, in the 20th century, the city played a key role in enabling the industrial economy by creating marketplaces and infrastructure to provide access to industrial materials and industrial products. Why shouldn't that be the case within the context of the information economy? Why is the city absent when it comes to enabling that information economy within the city? Shouldn't they play a more active role in creating a marketplace, but also creating the infrastructure to enable that? And that's really what this is all about. You've got data coming in at the front end of the value chain. That data is stored. You can analyze that data. But then critically, you have this thing in the middle that's cryptically called a service delivery platform. That's just like iTunes, right? iTunes is a service delivery platform. It allows people to develop applications that are on the front end that access data and enable you to buy a service. The service delivery platform is just that. It's enabling data to get to people and to people to be able to pay for it. And then finally, you have apps on the far end. So all we're saying is, why don't we do this? Why don't we develop a role with a city to enable both public and private data to be transacted for third parties, people like Vinay, the next speaker, who runs a digital design agency, to start developing applications. And this has three benefits. The first benefit is that the city gets new applications that makes the city a better place to live, work, and play. Right? It makes it easier to navigate. The second is we're developing new companies, like Vinay's company, that are going to start paying taxes, right? And that's a good thing, and start employing people. And the third thing is that this is going to position the city to become a growth engine in the international economy, because the first cities that develop this approach to an urban information economy will be the same type of cities as Liverpool and Glasgow and Hamburg were in the industrial economy. They were funded and fueled by the growth of the industrial economy. This hasn't yet happened in the information economy. And I think Copenhagen could be clear. And that's why I think what Clean are doing in catalyzing this with the city is so important and so innovative. And that's why I've been highlighting it around the world to other cities that want to get into the same space. So I'll go through this relatively quickly, but as I see it, there are basically two ways to do the design of this type of marketplace. On the one hand, I could look at what the existing data sets are in the city. I can then start to think about what are the use cases that I could develop around the data sets. And then I can find a way of developing some sort of proof of concept that is able to demonstrate that. The alternative approach is to take a much more anthropological approach to this and say, you know what, some data sets are really good, but rather than looking at the data and the technology, let's look at the challenges. Because if we know that we're tackling challenges that are meaningful to the population, then it's very clear that there's going to be based in a value proposition that resonates. And if it resonates with citizens and businesses, then there's political capital behind it. And ultimately, if what we're trying to do is encourage city leaders to invest in the development of the marketplace, they need to understand how life will be fundamentally different as a consequence of having this marketplace. And that needs to therefore be rooted in a clear value proposition that everyone understands. So when we started to pull together our consortium, the first people we went to were Vinay and his company to understand what does it really mean to be a small business that would want to operate on this platform. What are the needs of a business like that? But also another company, a small company that isn't here today, but is a Danish company called Social Action. Tobias and his team at Social Action are social anthropologists. They go out into the field and they explore opportunities. And those two companies are the cornerstone of our consortium and our bid. And we wanted them to be right at the core of designing how we're going to develop this proposition and deliver the proposition. So the next thing we did after determining that we were going to do a human-centered design approach was to define the design principles. And these are the 6 things that we came up with Vinay and Tobias and the team. We wanted it to be clearly human-centered as a design approach. We wanted this solution to be exportable and replicatable, right? So we wanted this to be an architecture that any city in Denmark, but for that matter, any city anywhere in the world would be able to adopt. So if I'm an app developer in Copenhagen using this platform, I could develop a similar app whether I was in Ohio or whether I was in Bogota. Because the key to iTunes is that there are several billion potential users. And when you've got several billion potential customers, then you've got an incentive to start developing apps. If I limit this to 4 million users, it suddenly doesn't become quite as interesting a platform to start doing the development on. The third thing is it had to be inclusive. So when we were starting to develop the applications and the use cases, we were thinking, how is this going to help anyone and everyone? Whether that's my grandmother or whether it's a 4-year-old child, they clearly have different requirements within the context of the city, but they're just as valid as each other. But not only that, it has to be inclusive of every developer, whether that's Vinay or whether it's IBM. They should still be able to develop applications on this, and we shouldn't be crowding out the marketplace and not allowing those small developers to be able to function. And that's linked to the question of open by default. We should be developing an architecture that is open by default, that lowers the barriers to participation and allows other people to replicate this. If we want other cities to adopt this platform, it should be based on open standards. Then it needs to be modular and it needs to be scalable. Because if we try and create this behemoth of a platform that does everything to everyone immediately, we're bound to fail. We need to start small, focus on 1 or 2 use cases that demonstrate the value proposition, but make sure that it's highly extensible and modular in the way that we design it. So that when we want to scale it, there aren't limitations to scale, but also when we want to bring in different types of data sets, they're not limited in that context. And then finally, it has to be self-improving. We need to be in a situation where the platform will continue to iterate and will get better and better over time. It'll be evolutionary. These are the first baby steps that the platform will be taking. It needs to be built in from the beginning. So we started with a very clear approach to how we developed the use cases. And it was a blend of a desk-based approach and a field-based anthropological approach. So we started with kind of what is our initial ambition, what are the challenges that the city is facing, and what are the kind of technology trends that we're starting to see emerging within the context of the city. That then got us to a series of use case themes that we started to explore in much more detail. And it's at that point that Tobias and his team went out into the field and started doing the interviews. And Vinay and his team were looking at what could be done with the data sets that were currently available. But it was a twin-track approach. And I wouldn't put more or less value on either of them, but I think the anthropological piece at this stage was absolutely critical because it had to be user-tested. I don't have time now, but I could give a really interesting little mini case of where we were trying to address parking as an issue. And we got quite a long way down the role of developing that use case, being steered by the fact that parking was a massive issue. But when we sent Tobias and the anthropologists out into the field to really observe the way that people make decisions about parking, all our assumptions in the development of the use case were negated immediately because it wasn't actually how things happen in the field. Our assumptions about how people make decisions weren't right. And that's why you have to kill use cases just as frequently as you develop them. So from there, we started developing day in the life of scenarios. So coming back to that question about creating narrative, if we want to be able to sell this, we need to be able to tell that story of how a day in somebody's life will be fundamentally different 1 year from now as it is from today. And that has to be a narrative. It has to be a story because politicians sell stories. When Frank Jensen and his team stand up and talk about this platform, he won't be talking about the various different programming languages that are being used on the platform. He will be talking about the use case that is being defined and how life will be different as a consequence of the development of this platform. So we have to start seeding those stories. So we went and did the detailed assessment. We did a whole bunch of desk-based analysis around the themes, and we went and saw what the city challenges really are and what they're documented as. And we then went and did and identified 8 areas that we really wanted to focus on. And I think all of these are fairly self-evident for most of you, because I'm guessing the majority of you are Copenhageners. But energy efficiency is a clear target. Mobility and transportation, there are several challenges that are facing the city. Parking might be one of them, but also intermodality of public transport access is a critical issue within the city that has to be addressed. Health and welfare, from the capital region's perspective, they're just as interested in the management of chronic disease, chronic lung disease, chronic heart disease, type 2 diabetes. These are all important issues that a platform like this could address. So as I say, what we actually did was work with Tobias and Vinay's team to start developing these little day-in-the-life-of scenarios. And they were a combination of narrative storytelling and graphic design. We were trying to tell an animated story of how a day in somebody's life would progress. And we just found it was the easiest way to communicate what we were trying to achieve. Ultimately, this could be done by video, it could be done by some sort of animatronics. Doesn't really matter. What matters is you use the medium that communicates the message most effectively and demonstrates the journey that we're going on. So we ended up with a very long list of potential use cases. Through that process, we then started to put filters onto the use cases. And the 2 filters we applied first were, how much value does this create in measurable terms? Carbon emission savings, improvements in public health, reduction in journey time, whatever the metrics are that deliver social, environmental, and economic value. All 3 were equally measured within this context. But ultimately, what matters is that the value that you're measuring resonates with the people you're delivering the value to. So if you put yourself in Frank Jensen's shoes, he stands on a manifesto statement of delivering certain outcomes. You have to measure outcomes that relate to his agenda if you want this to sell. Sorry to be cynical, but that's the way of the world, right? The other question is ease of implementation. Can we really get this delivered at a reasonable cost in order to demonstrate that feasibility and with a reasonable expectation of success? What we didn't want to do is bite off more than we could chew, fail in the implementation, and then Frank and his team turn around and say, oh, yeah, it was a really great idea, but it's all quite difficult. I think we'll just call it a day, right? So we took those 2, modeled all the use cases, and came down to a pretty short list. We then started developing some schematics. I think I have a schematic on the next slide. And then in a combination of work with Vinay's team and our team, we were trying to work out how would this actually translate into the technology. And it's only at this point in the process, of a 6-month process, 4.5 months down the line, that we started to think about the data and the technology. Everything else was about value and anthropology. So then we started developing these schematics that look at data flows. What data would we need? What kind of data transformation would be required? What kind of applications would you want to develop? How would you present that data? And make it available at that stage. And from there, we then started to get to a position where we thought, okay, we now know this use case in enough detail that this is at a point where we could really propose this as a pilot. And at this stage, we're 2 days away from submitting our proposal. I think we got a really clear view of what it is that we're going to be developing. I think we want to be able to demonstrate, not that we can provide lots of different data sets to everyone. What we want to do is take a deep vertical slice and say, you know what? This could apply to a whole series of different data sets. But what we want to demonstrate is not that we can present data to people, but that we can deliver value and that we can demonstrate how a company like Leapcraft would be able to do this innovation on their own free will. All that we would be creating with the city is a platform for that innovation. What matters is the fantastic innovation that comes out of companies like Vinay's. And this is about enabling that level of innovation for the design community within Copenhagen. And I can't think of anywhere better to do that than with a city like Copenhagen, where the heritage of great design is already embedded. And telling this story to other cities, I think they are now starting to understand that it's not about the technology. Technology should be the servant and not the master. What we really need to do is root this in value and root this in a really clear understanding of what the challenges are of the people that live and work and play in these cities and visit these cities. So that's all I was going to say today. I'll be around for the next couple of hours.